How much does an American skyline cost in human life? I went looking for the answer in the records of the International Association of Bridge, Structural, Ornamental, and Reinforcing Ironworkers, the union that has represented the men and women who erect structural steel since 1896. And what I found was not a tragedy, it was a formula. Crew foremen in the early decades of skyscraper construction expected one man to die for every $1 million spent on the project. 1 death per million. The Empire State Building cost $41 million to build. By the formula, the expected death toll was 41 men. The official count was 5. The Chrysler Building cost $20 million. The George Washington Bridge cost $75 million. The Golden Gate Bridge cost $35 million. The formula was not a secret. It was not whispered between foremen in private. It was accepted as the normal cost of doing business in the structural steel industry for roughly 3 decades, from the turn of the century through the 1930s. The deaths were a line item. They were built into the budget the way the cost of rivets and concrete were built into the budget. The company did not hide the formula. It did not need to. Nobody was asking it to justify the number. That formula is the machine this video is about. Not the rivet gun, not the crane, not the derrick or the hoist or the beam. The formula. The calculation that said a certain number of men would die and the building would be built anyway and the deaths would be absorbed as a cost of the skyline. The same calculation that appears in every video on this channel. The guard slows the line. The coupler costs money. The ventilation furnace burns fuel. The geological survey takes time. The death is a ratio. The ratio is acceptable. The building goes up. The men who worked the high steel in the first half of the 20th century had no safety harnesses, no hard hats, no fall protection of any kind, no nets below the steel, no lines tying them to the structure. They worked on beams 8 inches wide, hundreds of feet above the street, in wind and rain and ice and fog, with nothing between them and the ground except the grip of their boots on the steel and the balance they had spent years training their bodies to maintain. They were called roughnecks. They were called skyboys. They were called cowboys of the sky. And the ones who came from the Kahnawake Mohawk Reserve near Montreal, the men who had been working structural steel since 1886 and who built a significant portion of the New York City skyline, were called Skywalkers. The Mohawk Skywalker tradition began in 1886, when the Canadian Pacific Railway contracted to build the Victoria Bridge across the St. Lawrence River, which borders the Kahnawake Reserve. The company needed labor. It hired local Mohawk men from Kahnawake to work on the bridge. Almost immediately, the supervisors noticed something. The Mohawk workers moved across the steel with an ease and a steadiness that the other laborers did not display. They climbed the beams without hesitation. They walked narrow surfaces at height without visible fear. The company began assigning them to the most exposed positions on the structure, the positions that required the most balance, the most composure, and the least inclination to look down. The Mohawk themselves have described this not as fearlessness, but as something more deliberate. Don Angus, a Kahnawake ironworker, said simply, "You've got to watch it up there." The Skywalkers do not claim to be without fear. They claim to control it. They learn from their elders. They learn from the men who walked the steel before them, fathers and uncles and grandfathers who taught them the rhythm of the work, the way you place your feet, the way you read the wind, the way you move your weight across a beam, the way you trust the man beside you. Because if you do not trust him, you cannot do the work. By the 1890s, Kahnawake Mohawk riveting gangs were working on bridges across the northeastern United States and Canada. They trained their own crews. They formed their own gangs. By 1907, over 70 men from the Kahnawake First Nation were experienced bridge workers, and the Mohawk reputation for high steel work was established in every structural steel contractor's office on the continent. Then the Quebec Bridge fell. On August 29, 1907, during the construction of the Quebec Bridge across the St. Lawrence River near Quebec City, a cantilever span collapsed. The bridge had been designed by Theodore Cooper, an engineer who wanted to build the longest cantilever bridge in the world. To win the contract, Cooper had specified less steel than was structurally necessary for a bridge of that span. The company, strapped for cash, accepted his design. Workers on the bridge had noticed that the girders were shifting, bending under the load, deforming in ways that were visibly wrong. They reported it. Cooper, working from his office in New York, delayed his response. By the time he sent a telegram ordering work to stop, it was too late. At 5:32 in the afternoon, 2 minutes after the whistle sounded the end of the workday, the structure buckled and plunged into the St. Lawrence River. 75 men died. 33 of them were Mohawk from Kahnawake. More than 2/3 of the dead Mohawk men were married. They left behind 24 widows and dozens of children. In a community where ironworking had become the primary source of income, where entire families depended on the wages the men brought home from the steel, the loss of 33 men in a single afternoon was a blow that threatened the survival of the community itself. The Mohawk women of Kahnawake responded. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, of which the Mohawk are a founding nation, operates in a matrilineal system. The women hold authority over clan decisions. The women of Kahnawake demanded that the ironworkers change their practices. No more family groups working on the same project. No more entire crews from Kahnawake on a single bridge or building. The men had to split up. They had to spread out across multiple job sites so that a single collapse could never again take half the community's working men in one afternoon. The practice became known as booming out. The ironworkers boomed out from Kahnawake to projects across the Northeast, working in smaller groups on separate buildings in separate cities, sending their wages home and returning on weekends or at the end of the job. The Quebec Bridge collapse did not stop the Kahnawake Mohawk from working high steel. It did the opposite. According to an elderly Mohawk man quoted in a 1949 New Yorker article by Joseph Mitchell, the disaster made high steel much more interesting to them. It made them take pride in themselves that they could do such dangerous work. Less than 10 years after the collapse, the American Board of Indian Commissioners reported that 587 of the 651 men in the Kahnawake community belonged to the Structural Steel Union. Almost 90% of the working men in the community were ironworkers. If your family came from Kahnawake or Akwesasne or Six Nations, if your grandfather or great-grandfather worked the high steel in New York, or Montreal or Detroit or Chicago, if there is a steel girder crossing the cemetery at Kahnawake, marking a grave that belongs to someone in your line, subscribe if you want to see what I find next. By the 1920s, the Kahnawake ironworkers had moved from bridges to buildings. The skyscraper era had arrived. New York City was racing upward. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, 30 Rock, the Waldorf Astoria, the George Washington Bridge, all of them required structural steel, and all of them required men who would walk that steel at heights that made other men's legs go weak. The Mohawk riveting gangs spoke their native Kahnawake language on the job while building the Manhattan skyline. They caught red-hot rivets in metal cans tossed from the forge. They braced them with dolly bars while the pneumatic hammers mushroomed the stems. They did this standing on 8-inch beams with nothing beneath them but air and the street. A 4-man riveting gang was the basic unit of skyscraper construction in the 1920s and 1930s. The heater fired the rivets in a portable forge on the beam until they were cherry red, roughly 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The sticker-in caught the thrown rivet in a metal can or a heavy glove and placed it in the hole. The bucker-up braced the rivet from the backside with a dolly bar, absorbing the impact of the hammer. The riveter drove the pneumatic hammer against the hot rivet stem, mushrooming it flat, locking the two steel members together. The entire operation took seconds. The forge was on the beam. The rivet was thrown across open space. The men caught it, placed it, braced it, and hammered it hundreds of feet above the ground in wind that gusted across the face of the building at speeds that on the ground would barely be noticed, but at 800 feet could stagger a man sideways on a beam. The men who did this work earned $15 a day during the construction of the Empire State Building. That was good money in 1930. It was substantially more than the average laborer's wage. The premium was the price of the height. The premium was the company's acknowledgement that the work was dangerous enough that ordinary wages would not attract the men willing to do it. The $15 was the ironworkers' $5 day. The Empire State Building was constructed in 13 months from March 1930 to April 1931. At peak activity, 3,400 workers were on site simultaneously. The structural steel was erected by gangs of ironworkers who set an average of 4.5 floors per week, a pace that had never been achieved on a building of that height, and that has rarely been matched since. The building rose at a rate that astonished the public and the press. Photographs from the construction, many of them taken by Lewis Hine, show men sitting on beams, eating lunch with their legs dangling over the void, men walking narrow planks between the rivet forge and the next connection point, men standing on the topmost steel with nothing around them but sky and the city far below. 5 men died during the construction. The official records name them only partially. 1 man was struck by a truck, 1 was hit by a hoist, 1 fell down an elevator shaft, 2 were struck by falling objects. None of the recorded deaths involved an ironworker falling from the structural steel. This is the detail that the public finds most surprising, because the photographs suggest that falling was the obvious and inevitable danger. The 5 deaths were caused by ground level and mid-level hazards, not by the high steelwork itself. Whether this reflects genuinely safer conditions on the upper floors, or whether falls from height were underreported because the bodies were recovered quietly and the work continued without documentation, is a question that the historical record does not answer definitively. Unfounded rumors published in the New York Daily News put the death toll at 14. Other sources have suggested hundreds. The official count remains 5. The formula said 41. Every major infrastructure project of the era carried its own version of the formula's arithmetic. The Hoover Dam, built between 1931 and 1936 at a cost of $49 million, killed 96 workers by the official count. The George Washington Bridge, completed in 1931 at a cost of $75 million, killed 12 during construction. The Chrysler Building, completed in 1930 at a cost of $20 million, reported no official death toll, a silence that suggests either remarkable safety or incomplete records, or both. The Golden Gate Bridge, completed in 1937 at a cost of $35 million, killed 11 men during construction. It is famous for the one piece of safety equipment that no other major project of the era had used. Joseph Strauss, the chief engineer of the Golden Gate Bridge, required the installation of a safety net beneath the bridge deck during construction. The net hung beneath the work platform and extended 10 feet on either side. It cost $130,000. It was the first time a major construction project had used a safety net for structural steelwork. The net saved 19 men who fell during the course of the project. Those 19 men formed an informal club. They called themselves the Halfway to Hell Club, because the net had caught them halfway between the bridge and the water, which was the next stop if the net had not been there. On February 17, 1937, a section of scaffold carrying 12 men broke free and fell into the net. The weight of the scaffold and the men tore through the net. 10 of the 12 men fell into San Francisco Bay and died. The net had held for 19 saves. It failed on the 20th event because the load exceeded what the net was designed to bear. Even the safety system that worked, the one safety system that had been installed on any major project of the era, failed when the load was large enough. The safety net on the Golden Gate Bridge was an exception. No other major bridge, building, or infrastructure project of the 1920s and the 1930s used one. The ironworkers on the Empire State Building had no net. The ironworkers on the Chrysler Building had no net. The ironworkers on the George Washington Bridge had no net. The men on Rockefeller Center, on the Triborough Bridge, on every skyscraper and span built in the most prolific construction era in American history, worked without fall protection of any kind. No harness, no line, no net, no hard hat in many cases. The photographs show men in cloth caps and leather shoes, standing on steel, hundreds of feet above the city, with their hands in their pockets. The reason there were no safety nets, no harnesses, no fall protection systems, was the same reason there were no guards on the power presses and no automatic couplers on the freight cars, and no steel passenger cars on the railroads, and no ventilation furnaces running on weekends. The safety equipment existed. Nets existed. Harnesses existed. They were not required. They cost money. They slowed the work. And the men who would have been saved by them were, in the formula's arithmetic, an acceptable loss, 1 per million, built into the budget, a line item in the cost of the Skyline. The ironworkers who fell did not always die from the fall. Some were caught by lower beams or scaffolding. Some fell into partially enclosed sections of the building and survived with broken bones. Some fell and were never found. Their disappearance attributed to quitting the job without notice, because immigrant laborers in the 1920s and the 1930s did not always leave forwarding addresses, and nobody checked whether a man who stopped showing up to work had gone home or gone into the ground. The International Association of Ironworkers death records are incomplete for the early decades. The union documented what it could. The companies documented what they chose. The gap between the two is the same gap that runs through the Chinese railroad workers' records and the Fraterville mine records and the DuPont Powder Works records and every other record on this channel where the count of the dead depends on who was doing the counting and what they considered worth counting. Today, ironworkers still die at a rate of 35 to 50 fatalities per year in the United States, most of them from falls. OSHA requires fall protection for any work performed at heights greater than 6 feet. Harnesses are mandatory. Hard hats are mandatory. Safety nets are required in many applications. The regulations exist. The enforcement exists. And the men still fall. The iron still kills. The rate has declined dramatically from the era of the formula, but it has not reached zero. And it will not reach zero as long as human beings are required to stand on narrow steel at height and connect structural members with tools that weigh as much as their arms. At the Kahnawake Mohawk Reserve near Montreal, the cemetery contains the graves of ironworkers who fell from the high steel over the past century and a half. The graves are marked with crosses. The crosses are made of steel, not wood, not stone, steel, lengths of structural steel, cut and welded into the shape of a cross, standing over the graves of the men who spent their working lives walking on the same material. The steel that they walked on is the steel that marks where they are buried. The material is the same. The form has changed. A beam becomes a cross. A workplace becomes a memorial. The steel does not know the difference. I keep coming back to those crosses. The Kahnawake Cemetery is the quiet center of this entire story. The men who worked the high steel, who built the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building and Rockefeller Center and the George Washington Bridge, who spoke Mohawk on the beams while they caught red-hot rivets and drove them home with pneumatic hammers at 800 feet, who controlled their fear because their elders had taught them to control it, who boomed out from the reserve to job sites across the continent because the women of Kahnawake had demanded after the Quebec Bridge collapse that the men never again work together in one place. Those men are buried under crosses made from the steel they spent their lives walking on. The cemetery is not famous. The tourists do not come. The photographs of men sitting on beams eating lunch are famous. The cemetery is not. The formula said 1 death per million. The Skyline cost billions. The math is there for anyone who wants to do it. The ironworkers did it every morning when they climbed the steel and looked down and knew that the formula was running and the budget had a number in it and the number was them. They climbed anyway. They walked the beam anyway. They caught the rivet anyway. Because the work paid well and the work was what they knew, and the alternative was a job on the ground that paid less and meant less and did not carry the weight that walking the high steel carried in their families and their communities and their understanding of what it meant to be a man who could do what other men could not. The formula was not a guess. It was not an estimate. It was an observed ratio derived from decades of construction data, accepted by the industry, cited by foremen, built into project budgets, and applied to every major building, bridge, and infrastructure project in the most productive construction era in American history. 1 death per $1 million. The deaths were not accidents in the way that a car crash is an accident. They were statistical certainties. The industry knew, before the first beam was set, approximately how many men would die. It set the beam anyway, it built the building anyway, it completed the skyline anyway, and the men who died became part of the structure in the most literal sense available, because their labor is in every rivet and every connection and every beam, and the formula that predicted their deaths is in the budget that paid for the beam. I started with the formula. 1 death per $1 million spent. I went looking for the source and found it in the open records of an industry that did not hide the number because the number was considered normal. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate, the Brooklyn Bridge, the skyline that every tourist photographs and every postcard reproduces and every child recognizes. Every building in it was built by men who stood on 8-inch beams hundreds of feet above the street with no harness and no net and no line, who earned $15 a day, who were counted in a formula that said some of them would die and the building would go up regardless. The formula was the cost, the skyline was the product, and at the Kahnawake cemetery the graves of the men who built the skyline are marked with crosses made of the same steel they spent their lives walking on. Because the material does not change, only the form, and the form of a beam and the form of a cross are not as different as they appear. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces, under 40-ton weights. And sometimes, on an 8-inch beam, 800 feet above the street, with a rivet in one hand and nothing in the other, and the wind coming across the face of the building and the formula running in the background and the budget absorbing the cost, and the man on the beam knowing, the way every man on this channel is known, that the machine he was standing inside was not designed to bring him home. There are more of these stories. More machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different, or did not come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how the machines that moved an entire town in Minnesota because the mine wanted the ground, that video's on screen now.